And welcome to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, where we are broadcasting from this historic Diggi Palace that you're seeing, which in otherwise would be crowded with 1 million people. It's our pleasure to present today the Edict Project, Music and Meaning for Our Times, T.M. Krishna in conversation with Manasi Subramaniam, and of course, protected by Dettol. T.M. Krishna is a public intellectual and acclaimed classical vocalist in the Carnatic tradition. He is dedicated to working across the spectrum of music, society and culture. The Edict Project, in association with the Ashoka University, is a creative collaboration that seeks to musically rediscover Emperor Ashoka's ancient edicts, philosophies that speak of a more humane society built on empathy and compassion, created during the period of the lockdown. They convey Krishna's conviction that the world can be healed through a deep understanding of music, an inspirational and multidisciplinary session that searches history and culture to frame words, music, and meaning for our times. Krishna's latest book is Sebastian and Sons. As a public intellect, T.M. Krishna speaks and writes about the issues affecting the human condition and about matters cultural. Krishna started and is involved in many organizations whose work is spread across the whole spectrum of music and culture. His co-authored Voices Within, Carnatic Music, Passing On, and Inheritance, a book dedicated to the greats of Carnatic music. His path-breaking book, A Southern Music, The Carnatic Story, was a first of its kind philosophical, aesthetic, and socio-political exploration of the genre. In 2016, Krishna received the prestigious Raymond Magsaysay Award. His latest book, Sebastian and Son, traces the history of the Mridangam makers and the Mridangam over the past 100 years. Manasi Subramaniam is an executive editor and the head of literary rights at Penguin Random House, India. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below. Ladies and gentlemen, the Edict Project, Music and Meaning for Our Times, T.M. Krishna, conversation with Manasi Subramaniam in association with the Bergen Literature Festival.
Thank you, Sanjay. Hello, everyone. It's such a privilege for me to be in conversation with T.M. Krishna at the Jaipur Literature Festival. So T.M. Krishna is someone whose enthusiasm for and engagement with critical and cultural debate I have tremendous admiration for. He's also someone, and I have to mention this, whose singing voice is so perfect it can literally melt butter. He is an extraordinarily thoughtful and generous writer. His book, A Southern Music, is a classic for the ages, although I should mention here that TM doesn't like the usage of words like classic and classical, but we'll come back to that. And his most recent book is Sebastian and Sons. I'm also delighted that I'll be publishing his next book. This is a collection of his published and unpublished writing. It's called The Spirit of Inquiry, Dissent as an Art Form, and it's out from Penguin in May 2021. But we're here now to discuss TM's latest initiative, the Edict Project. So let's get started. So TM, what is the Edict Project and what are the edicts?
Well, I mean, honestly, for me, for a very long time, the edict was what it has been for most of us who have read history in school. That one page in a history text where we read about Ashoka and Kalinga and his transformation, and then you have these rock pillars across the country where he sends out messages. It was pretty much that. I didn't really know much about what was really said. Yes, we know about Sarnath. I mean, all that is very kind of tertiary information, if I can say that. That remains with us. It was, I think, a couple of years ago when Gopal Krishna Gandhi actually in some conversation just suggested to me and said, why don't you just read the edicts? Just look at them. And that was the trigger. So I just spent about 8 months just looking at it once in a while. You know, one of those readings that you do, the translations are available. And then at one point, it just, you know, they really touched me deeply because a lot of things that Ashoka communicates are very relatable to our times, both as an individual, as a king, as somebody who sees himself as transformed, if I can say that, and believes that society needs to transform in an ethical way, and compassion needs to be the basis of anything. All that was there was a lot of resonance with the kind of struggles we're having today, where we are filled with a lot of anger and hatred and binary visions of each other, that I think we have lost even the ability to listen, let alone disagree on anything, right? We don't even listen. So I just said, okay, why don't we start working on it? I didn't know anything. You must understand, this is ancient Magadhi Prakrit. Some scholars call it Ashokan Prakrit because there are so many versions to it. I didn't know how Prakrit sounded. I didn't, this is all basically prose, first of all, on stone. I don't think anybody has even read it aloud or recorded it in audio form in the last 2000 years. So everything was new. So I contacted a Buddhist scholar who gave me the first set of edicts in audio form and gave me the meanings. And we decided Dhamma was the theme. Then I had another wonderful linguist, Professor Naresh, who was consulting with me on how do I pronounce Prakrit. Then there is that whole aesthetic aspect, which is often ignored, is what happens to a language when it becomes music. We never discussed that. A lot of people make the big mistake of thinking that which is heard in word is what is heard in song. It is not. What is heard in song is a being of itself. How does that being happen? It happens through habit, through time, through multiple practitioners. Here I had no precedence to follow. I had nothing to imitate. So, I spent about 3 months just basically reading these edicts, 5 of them. And only after that, I decided to tune it. That's how the birth of this project was.
So when you say edicts, you mean the stone slabs that he also sent across to the rest of the world?
Exactly. So
how many would you say there are in total?
That's an important point you make, because one rock face or rock pillar has multiple edicts. Right. One is not one edict. Many people think each is an edict. I think there are about 37 such faces. I think number of edicts, I tried counting, it's over to 130 of them.
Wow.
But there are about 14 of them which are repeated, which are like the core messages that he's passing on. Some of them on Dharma, for example, are repeated. The other fascinating thing is it's not just it's also in other languages, not just in Prakrit, depending on where it was. It's in multiple dialects. So sometimes you'll find the same edicts having different versions depending on where it was. So another very important thing, I think I would connect it to the idea of federalism and multi-language country of India, where we don't have a national language. The whole idea that it goes in the language of the people of the place, but the message is, can we all live together? So I think it's fascinating if you look at the larger political discourse. So we have now worked with I have done 1 edition, and we hope to now work on another 4, 5 sets.
And these were also disseminated across South Asia, the subcontinent. Basically.
Absolutely, the edicts are mainly in what you would call today's Afghanistan, Nepal, India, Pakistan, these areas. But the messaging has gone over. The edicts are basically in the subcontinent.
Right. Are the carvings still to be found?
Yes, you can find the edicts. You find it in Karnataka. You find it in Andhra Pradesh. If you go to Pakistan, it's there. So it's there. I mean, the Sarnath we know about. So so Lumbini also there is an edict. So edicts everywhere. Yes.
And so you would conjecture that he probably got them translated before he sent them out.
I mean, I guess that he made sure that they were written in languages that was understood. The major language is, of course, the Prakrit of his times. But there is some in Greek also. So because his kingdom was so large. What he called Jambu Dvipa was his kingdom, which was pretty large.
So Greek, because I understand that he even sent one to Alexander the Great.
I mean, I don't know whether he sent an edict to Alexander the Great, but because his kingdom was all over the place. So you have Old Armenic, you have Greek, you have Prakrit also, yes.
And the content of the edicts, are they like advice mostly or musings? What are they like?
So, fundamentally, he's a king. So let's never forget that Ashoka is still a monarch who is trying to transform society in a way that he believes is important. And he also says he is transformed. So there is Well, the ego-less ego, there's even an expression like that. In the sense there is the king there, but he's also trying to say, I'm not like a monarch king. I want a good society. So there is messaging, there is instructions. Some of the edicts are also very local, like dedicated to some king or some local important person. So I'm leaving them aside. To keep them aside, you have advice to his bureaucrats on how they should behave, what they should do. You have advice to his people. You have sometimes minor warnings to certain people of saying, behave yourself, things like that. There is also public reflection, which is fascinating. In the reflection, there is Ashoka's vulnerability. There is also Ashoka deciding what he wants to share and what he doesn't want to share. One of the interesting things that Nayanjot Lahiri, Professor Nayanjot Lahiri, who is, India's most important Ashoka scholar, who is the advisor and partner on this project, pointed out is that he never mentions his ancestry. So in a way, he's almost breaking away from the past, right? He's saying, I'm not like the past and my kingdom is not like the past. So there is that very, very unusual for a dynast, because usually dynast says, I come from, our politicians do it today. So why won't dynasts do it? My father was this, my grandfather was this, right? So, but you have Ashoka not doing that. So I think there are multiple textures to what he passes on. There is also about how, in a way, there's a lot on ecology, on how the forest should be kept, how certain animals should be kept. There's also, I think this is very important, a lovely balance between his belief that animals should not be slaughtered and his understanding that that's part of culture. Eating meat is part of the culture. So he's almost like, that's very important, because today we look at it in yes or no terms. But he understands that struggle between culture and ahimsa, as an idea. So, there's so much if you really look at it. And the thing is, they're all real in the sense you can discuss them, you can learn from them, you can debate, you can criticize Ashoka too.
So, it's wide ranging. So basically it's Ashoka's Twitter feed.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, considering the number of syllables there are in each edict. It's probably, except some of the larger, but some of them really small. So yeah, it's like Ashoka's little tweets of wisdom that he passed on. Yeah, very much.
So do you think the advice is applicable today? Do you think it's traveled well across time?
That's exactly what excites me about it. Otherwise, I wouldn't, I have this ambivalent relationship with the past because I'm always worried that past becomes a nostalgic trip. And in some way, when we recall the past, we are saying something about the present. We are always talking about the past for the present. We're not talking for the past. So I'm worried that we get caught in this this imaginative notion of those days. It's not very different from what we say about the schools that we study in, right? We always think they were better when we were there. And actually, half the things we say about our schools are in our head. It never happened. So I'm always very, very nervous about the past, which is why, but in spite of that, I find Ashoka very important because he allows you to engage with the past in a very true sense. The things he says are relevant today. The things that you find problematic there are relevant today. Here, the whole idea of how does use ethical living and equality and power. For example, that's a fascinating point of conflict and flux. And that's there in Ashoka. That's there today. The ability, compassion is something universally seen. So how does, for example, a governing body think of compassion as being the basis of governance? And I think this is why the Indian Constitution is also important. Because the fundamental to the preamble of the Constitution is compassion. Because equality, all the socialistic ideal, equality, all these notions come only if there's that empathy and compassion as the foundation. So for me, it is intertwined, but I'm not saying they're perfect. And I think that's also important. I'm not looking at this project as a hagiographical reinvention of Ashoka for 2021. No way.
So, for example, that phrase that you just used, which is ethical living and power. Ashoka was, as you say, a powerful person. He was a ruler. How does one negotiate ethical living with power? Like, can people in positions of power lead in a way that is both ethical and humane? And if so, how can they?
Look, there is there is no clean slate on that one, is there? Because your power by itself is like a two-part animal. The first part is what it does to yourself as an individual. The second part is what it does to you in public space and your actions in public space, right? And power is doing something to these two parts of you always. Now, the question is, can you have a foundational idea of self and relationships that is like the conscience of every one of this? And I think that's where compassion and empathy comes in. Now, it doesn't mean it'll be ticked off always. It means there are going to be negotiations that are probably ugly. There will be situations where they don't happen. But can you keep this alive? And I think that's what Ashoka tries to do to a large extent. He tries to keep it alive. For example, we always talk about Ashoka and Kalinga, and there's something very interesting there. So the first set of edicts I sang, Ashoka talks about remorse. He talks about how he has remorse for what happened in Kalinga. He says that, Ashoka is contrite after what happened in Kalinga. He even asked, did he really win the war? I mean, was it a victory? It's kind of a reflection. But it's the same Ashoka who actually doesn't mention Kalinga or the massacre in the edict in Kalinga. Now, was that political strategy? Was that, why, for example? He doesn't say sorry to the people of Kalinga in his Kalinga edict. Right?
He doesn't acknowledge it?
No, not in this Kalinga edict. Not there. Kalinga is mentioned elsewhere. Now, this edict, which I read out, is not in that region. Right?
I mean, is that brave or cowardly?
We don't know. That's what I'm saying. It's very interesting. So is this stage, is it like craft? Is it political craft? Right? At the same time, so you have a person who feels remorse, because it's a very moving point when he says, did Ashoka win the war? I mean, it's such a moving idea that a king puts out in public. It's okay, but at the same time, he's not putting it out there in Kalinga. So is that part of political strategy? Now, the same Kalinga comes somewhere elsewhere when he speaks to people who are dwelling in forests, where he almost says, there's almost a warning that, kind of behave yourself, or please be part of what we are trying to construct here, which is a dharma and a moral society. If not something, I don't want the remorse of Kalinga happening again. In a way, saying that, there's going to be action. Now, so this is what I mean by the struggle of the ethical and power and governance. And that's there, for example, in this whole thing I told you. But I think that struggle, the fact that struggle is out there for us to think about is important. And like I said, does that mean that person becomes universally a better human being? Maybe not. Maybe at times they do not. But can the reflection remain? Which is why when Ashoka asked the question, did Ashoka win in public? It's an important political and personal statement.
So, speaking of power, so in your introduction to the Edict project on your website, you describe Ashoka as the philosopher emperor. So I'm going to be a little bit pedantic here. In Plato's Republic, he makes like a slightly controversial claim in the voice of Socrates that the ideal city will be ruled by philosophers. So he says that basically what he's saying is that only those who have no desire for power can actually truly be trusted with power. So he creates this idealized image of the philosopher king who will create a just, humane society. Do you think that kind of thinking translates today? Or what I'm actually asking is, can and should our politicians be thinkers first and foremost? Or do you think that might just be the kind of elitist and anti-democratic thinking that would lead to armchair intellectualism or tyranny?
That's a tough one, right? Because I think if you go back to Greek society and this notion of the philosopher king, and you can disagree with Plato on many things and agree with him on some things too, there is elitism completely dripping out of it. Because society then did see the plebeian in a certain fashion and the notion of the bourgeois in a certain fashion, the thinking, the philosophical class in some fashion. I do not think, when you say I would say rather than philosophers, I think we need people of different kinds. There are certain people whose philosophy comes from actual real experience. Now, just because the whole question is, if somebody can't articulate that experience, does that person not be a philosopher? That's the question that I would ask. Because a lot of the notion of philosopher comes from you being able to publish the idea, very bluntly put, or say the idea. So a philosopher is defined by the communication of the philosophy, right?
Yeah.
Right? Otherwise, it remains just a conceptual note.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's also possible for the conceptual note to translate directly into action without actually a literary or an oral articulation of it. So there is a certain philosophy in action in people who have experienced it. So I think especially people who experience the horrors of life of its multi dimensions, whether it is people of multiple sexes, whether it's people who are marginalized, they are philosophers of the living.
Right.
So I think we need those philosophers in public life. We also need possibly the privileged philosopher who's quasi armchair intellectual. That's fine. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with that notion of the armchair intellectual. As long as you don't pontificate, it's fine. That's what I think.
Yeah.
Because we always, we think that the armchair intellectual has no role. In which case, you can say that most thinkers have no role in life, right? Most thinkers are armchair intellectuals. What else are they?
Yeah.
That's exactly what they are. So as long as it's reflective and there is some amount of self-awareness in that process, we also need them in political life in some fashion.
So you just said also that in order to be a philosopher, you also need to be able to communicate your thought. And that's basically what Ashoka does. Ashoka is spreading the message. These edicts are spread across the Indian subcontinent, possibly even further. There's one gets a very strong sense that Ashoka believes that the written communication is a powerful tool in social change. So, I imagine that if Ashoka were around today, he would still find ways to communicate his thoughts through books or articles or, as I said, Twitter. But what I'm curious about is whether you believe today that change is possible through the written word in that way, or in your case, through the sung word. Can change happen through communication, social change?
I definitely believe so. I have absolutely no doubt in that. The only problem is in the world we live in, we look at change in a 24-hour news cycle. Right. That's our fundamental problem. So if you look at change, I do think whether it's the written word or whether it's the sung word or the spoken word, I think words still bring about a kind of change that you can't imagine in any other fashion. And they probably need more time to marinate. And we just need to give it that time. And I think a lot of the strong words are words that last beyond a generation. That the transformation sometimes kicks in after 5 years and 6 years, of experiencing. You have the momentary experience, but then you also have that lasting transformational experience that you never forget. And that kicks in when your life experience, in a way, reflects or questions that happening. So I definitely think it has great power. And I think Ashoka was very aware of it in his own time. He was very aware of it.
And what would you hope is the social change that might come about through the Edict project?
I think, the hope is that people start reflecting on the ideas that we have. And the idea that, first of all, a king, or shall we say a government, let's put it that way, a government needs to communicate to the people of the country on ideas of compassion and love. Can you last tell me when any government we know actually communicated to people on love, compassion, and empathy and living in that fashion? Very rare.
Political rhetoric tends to use the language of compassion and love.
That's it, right? But that's political rhetoric. You defined it yourself.
Yeah.
But this is about everyday living. It's about everyday living. So I think it definitely has a role today. These ideas have a role today. And if these become part of song, part of conversation, even part of debate, I mean, imagine if these are now discussed in classrooms in schools when children are reading that one paragraph on Ashoka. Instead of reading one paragraph, if they're actually looking at the edicts and saying this is what it says and they debate it, or it happens in colleges, you're actually having political science come alive in a way that it has not come alive before.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So there is great space, I think, for such a mode of relating with public life. And I think an emotional relationship with public life is very important. Today, we don't have an emotional relationship with public life. We have a tactical or opportunistic or desperate relationship because you have no choice
Yeah.
but to scream and shout.
Yeah. So through the edict project, what have the responses been like? Are students now debating some of the things that the edicts are saying? What is happening through the edict project?
Well, we have just started. So Ashoka University and myself, we're collaborating and doing this. We just started and released those first set of edicts. But the best emails I got were from history teachers.
History teachers.
Yeah, that's when you know, okay, this is worth it. Because when a history teacher wrote to me and said, I used those songs in my class.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, I just felt it was all worth it. I really don't care about anything else, because she said, I was discussing Ashoka. It was, of course, Zoom classes because everything is online now. But she said, what I did is I just played the edict. You're talking about Dharma, Buddhism, Dharma, Ashoka. I just played the edicts. And then we were discussing the edicts with my school students. That's fabulous, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's wonderful. So if that can happen, I think that's a great start. We still have a long way to go. We've just started it. But we hope to explore, and I hope to learn more. I'm still learning about Ashoka and about the edicts, and I'm no scholar by any stretch of imagination.
So, on the medium of the edicts project, you've composed the songs in Carnatic ragams. You've sung the lyrics in the original Prakrit, but you're also providing English subtitles. So, given the sort of artistically collaborative nature of the way you've done it and the way you've done the project, and the fact that you've been quite outspoken about words like classical being elitist, I'm curious about how you would define the aesthetics of this project. Or, what, if anything, is aesthetic according to you?
So, I agree with you. I mean, the whole idea that the so-called classical is singing Prakrit itself is an interesting thing that you could argue and debate. From the interior of the so-called classical world, I'll say that's a great thing that the classical is not only singing Sanskrit. But you could also say...
Is Prakrit considered a classical language?
No. It's not. Okay. It's not. It was a language of the people, and that's why the edicts were written in that. It does in sound, it's very unique compared to Sanskrit, of course, but there is a lot of similarity also. Now, I think one of the important things that we decided in the project after I started is that the edicts cannot remain in Prakrit. And they can't remain in the domain of the privileged art forms. So what we have actually just put in place is we have now looked at 4 more themes. And we have selected about 5 edicts per theme, put them together. And we've just started this, trying to create artist clusters in north, south, and east, west of India. We hope that each cluster will consist of a musician, an artist of movement, theater, or dance, a visual artist, definitely, maybe plastic arts, and they will collaborate on one of these themes, which will be given to them, and the language will be different. So in the south, maybe Tamil or Malayalam. In the west, it could be Marathi, Gujarati, Hindi in the north, maybe Khasi and some rock and roll from the northeast. So the idea is fundamentally to even question that notion of the classical, or question. So in a way, we want the edicts to happen multidisciplinary fashions. They're reimagined in different ways and sung in different languages. So the idea is that these teams will work on this for 5 to 6 months and come with a production, very much like I did. I just sang a song, but they'll come with a collaborative production that then is part of the project, and that is then disseminated as much as we can to the public and to schools and colleges. And one very important part of dissemination that Ashoka University are talking about is schools and colleges across the country. Right. So this kind of addresses the fact that it's not trapped only within the domains of TM Krishna.
But I can also imagine that in colleges, something like this could be like a college project. A group of students sitting together and making up their own little production.
Absolutely. It's possible that tomorrow school, looking at this, you have other people coming, doing many more things, picking other edicts. That's exactly, I think a very important aspect of any project that you do is that at some point of time, it stops becoming about you.
Mm.
It will start as being associated with the individual or with the group that's doing it. But at some point of time, that has to be lost, and which is, I think, what we want to happen. We're also hoping to try and get a cartoonist on board, and maybe that's going to be interesting also.
That sounds great.
Yeah, we're also thinking of that. So let's see.
So basically declaiming ownership so that everybody owns it.
Absolutely. And also multiple mediums. So each medium speaks to a different set of people with different cultures, with different aesthetics. So that's the idea. I mean, imagine if you could hear Ashoka's edicts in in rap. You know,
that sounds fun.
Exactly. That exactly now. It completely demystifies the individual, the edict, even time. This is the other important thing I think. As I speak to you, I realize in this project is demystifying ancient India and time.
Mm-hmm.
There is this fundamental mystification of ancient India that also needs to go. And I think by relating ideas that have been spoken then to today and problematizing them also, you demystify, you change the language, you bring it in today's modes of enjoyment or communication, then everything becomes real and today. The past by itself is of no value if it doesn't have a reimagination in the present.
Mm. And also in India, we tend to glorify the past, right?
No, that's the fundamental problem. The moment you mystify anything, everything becomes great. You can't even ask a question. I mean, I think that's a great strategy, actually. You make something so mystical. I mean, you and I cannot ask a question. No logic will prevail in that discussion, right? Once that's gone, questioning is in the dustbin.
It's like the emperor's new clothes. You either get it or you don't.
Exactly. And you're told that, aren't you, many times? Oh, you won't understand these things. And that basically means you're asking questions generally.
Yeah. So along the same lines of what we just spoke about, like in terms of classical and aesthetic, do you think art has an obligation to be political? Like, do you think art can exist for its own sake? And do you think immoral art can be aesthetically pleasing?
You have to define immoral for me before I respond to that.
Immoral in terms of the content of the art. So let's say Ashoka's edicts were saying, destroy the planet.
Okay. So I'll start from there, come back to the first question. I think this is a question that was asked me by a school student many years ago when I was talking about the idea of language being sound, an abstract idea. And I was talking about meaning. There's meaning in sound beyond meaning in the semantic. And I was giving this talk, and this 11th grader got up and said, Anna, I agree with everything you're saying, but I have a fundamental question to you. If there is a song that says that's violent, that encourages killing, will you still perform it and say it's just sound? What will you do? And I had never been faced with that question. I was actually stumped for a moment. It's one of those it's a conundrum. You don't have an answer to that, right? So what you're asking me is similar to that in some fashion, right? I would bluntly say, no, violence does not have space. But I would say, can you problematize it and then discuss? That would be interesting. This is not very different from problematizing, say, the artist who has a history which is deeply problematic, but art that is revered or lovely. What do you do? Do you basically throw the art out? So, the arguments are usually one-sided. Either you say, no, you can't deal with that individual or the art, or you say you separate them. I'm saying, no, you mess it up. You mess it up so that your experience of the art also gets messed up by the fact that the individual is deeply disturbing. So I would say that's what I would do if I have text or something that I think that needs to be shared because it has certain content that I disagree with. I'll problematize it and mess it up and make sure that we all debate it and argue it. But if you're saying that's going to be done as a communication messaging service to tell people to be violent, I'll say it has no space in civilization. It absolutely has no space.
Right.
Now, all art is inherently political. It's complete nonsense when artists say they are doing non-political. There's nothing called non-political art. There's nothing in this world that is non-political art. Because art is a representation. The moment I say that, it represents somebody at some point of time. There is ownership, there is membership, there is outsiders, there is acceptance, there is rejection, there is commencing. Every one of these aspects are inherent to art production, whatever art you may call it, right? Every word I use now is political entirely. So what the artist can say is that I don't engage with it. I don't engage with those things. You could say that, and I would say that's problematic. But somebody could say, I don't care about all that. In which case, the artist is basically saying that I don't care about any kind of a engagement with self-reflection about myself or what's around me.
Yeah, I mean, and also I suppose art entirely relies on the person receiving it, not on the person.
But all this is designed to a large extent. No, I mean, to be very honest, every art, we are very odd creatures. We think that there is we've almost programmed who produces art and who consumes the art. Every art form programs it also.
Yeah. But I also kind of think that I own my relationship with art. So if I hear you sing, then I own my relationship with your singing.
Absolutely. But that's also coming from membership that you and I have commonality with.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So there is that overarching membership within which, for example, in that overarching membership, you may choose to have a ownership of my music. Somebody else will have an ownership towards somebody else. But all of us are in the same pool. We are not in different pools. And suppose you have different categories, you have different lives in those different categories. Right? So all I'm saying is it's inherent. So art for art's sake, that very famous expression, depends on how you define art as. If you define art as fundamentally political, yes, I believe in art for art's sake. If you say art is not political, I say that is complete whole load of crap.
So we have about 5 minutes. So why don't you sing us an edict and we will decide whether it feels like a political act or not.
So I'll just sing a bit of... This is the set that we initially released, so I'll try and sing maybe a couple of it. Muni se pajamama atha pajaye इच्छामि हकों क्योंकि मुनि से पजाममा अथा पजाए इच्छामि हकों क्योंकि सवे नहित सुखे नहिदलोकिका पालालोकिकायं मुनि से पजाममा अथा पजाए इच्छामि हकों क्योंकि सवे नहित सुखे नहिद लोकिका पालालोकिकायं मपनि स पनि गरि ग सरि पग मरि सनि सदा पम ऋग म पद नि नस्ति एदिशं दानं यादिशं धर्मदानं नास्ति एदिशं दानं यादिशं धर्मदानं धर्म संस्तवो Edisham Danam Yadisham Dharma Dayanam Dharma Saustavo Dharma Sauvibhago Dharma Sambandho Sadama Padama Gari Gani Sariga Mariga Pada Sapada Sarita Samavayo Eva Sadhu. It goes on that way.
That was wonderful. That was really wonderful. Can you tell us what that meant?
Yeah, I mean, the first edict, Munise Paja Mama Atha Pajaye Chami Hakam Kyunti Savena Hita Sukhena Ida Lokika Pala Lokikayam. He basically says, all my people are my children. I yearn for their welfare, but welfare how? He asks the question. Then he says, good in this world and the other. The next edict, all these edicts are not in the same place, they were from different locations.
Okay.
The next one is Nasti Erisham Danam Yadisham Dharma Danam Dharma Samstavo Dharma Samvibhago Dharma Samstavo Dharma Samvibhago Dharma Sambandho. This is actually quite gorgeous. He says there's no gift like the gift of justice. Now, a lot of people have also asked this question of how we translated Dhamma or Dharma as justice. Usually it's translated as righteousness by many people. So it's because I think the righteousness in governance is justice in a way. So the morality of that comes through the act of justice in governance. And that's why we use the word justice here. And I think justice has a larger pervading meaning than just being part of law. So he says something beautiful. There's no gift like justice. And then he says, like the celebration of justice. And says, and participating in justice. Then he says something quite beautiful. He says, in the next edict, which I did not sing, Tasamabayo eva sadhu kyonti is a question. Dhammam srunaru annasta dhammam srunaru annam annasta dhammam srunaru cha susumsera cha. Here he says, harmony is very important. It's beautiful. But he says, what is harmony? He says, listening to the reflections on Dhamma, listening to another's reflection on Dhamma. I mean, it's also, I think, Mansi, got to do with our own imagination of how we want to relate to these things. That's where they really live. They don't just live in the text. So rediscovering them today is also for me to find the imagination of justice. So listening to the reflections of another on Dhamma, isn't that fundamentally what we don't have today? That there are different notions of this, and can we listen? And the last edict which we use is the edict where he mentions Kalinga. Tato pacha adhuna ladheshu kalingeshu tivre dhamma shilana dhamma kamata dhammanu shasticha devana priyasa so asti anusochana devana priyasa vijiniti cha kalingani. In this he says Kalinga was one. Then he says, this is where he says Ashoka was contrite. And then he asks, asking the question, did Ashoka, that is Devana Priyasa, really win Kalinga? And it's quite fascinating. I think we can ask that question of ourselves, when maybe politicians can ask the question when after winning elections and then doing whatever they want, did you really win? I think that would be a fascinating question they should ask themselves.
I would love to hear the answers to that. Right, I think our time is up, but thank you, TM. It is a privilege to hear you speak and a privilege to hear you sing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mansi, for a lovely conversation. I love conversations because they also make me think again and again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, T.M. Krishna. Thank you, Manasi Subramaniam, for that brilliant session. And the two takeaways certainly for me was Ashoka's edicts were the Twitter of his time. And the other, which I think is most brilliant, is having won Kalinga, did he feel that he'd actually won it? These are questions that need to be answered and thought over and delved, and I believe that the world can be healed through a deeper understanding of everything around us, including history and, of course, music. We thank our celebration partners, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. And please stay logged on to continue watching the next set of series. If you want, you can go and click on the Darbar Hall or the front lawn, or go and visit any of our wonderful craft products and do some online therapy, retail therapy as well at Earth Fables. You can also buy your books from Amazon online. Just click through. And as I keep saying to you, we really need your support in so many different ways. Please do click the contribute button, and whatever you can help us, whatever you can help contribute to continue to allow for the free flow of knowledge and information, do that. We at Teamwork really need your help. And finally, do remember to tweet using Jaipur Literature Festival 2021. That's the hashtag. And our Twitter handle and all our other handles are Jaipur LitFest. The festival is protected by Dettol. See you soon.